As extreme heat waves become hotter and more frequent, some places are becoming virtually uninhabitable.
And the question remains, with climate change, how much worse can it get? Well, now let's take a look.
As extreme heat waves become hotter and more frequent, some places are starting to feel nearly uninhabitable. The question is, with climate change, how much worse will it get? Scientists say it depends on what we do to cut our greenhouse gas emissions.
I don't think that it's fair to say that those regions are in the near term going to become too hot to live. There may be a point in time, decades in the future, maybe a century in the future, where there will be regions that will really be difficult to live.
When scientists think about what makes a place too hot to live in, it's not just the heat, it's also the humidity. We know a hot day feels worse when it's humid. There's good reason for that. Our bodies cool off by sweating, but that cooling system doesn't work as well when it's humid. I'll show you why. It's about 22 degrees here in the kitchen. This water is a little bit cooler, but when I take the thermometer out of the water and it's wet, the temperature is going to start to go down, and that's water evaporating off the thermometer and carrying some of that heat with it. And that's basically the same thing we do when we sweat. We've got water on our skin, and it's evaporating, and it's carrying some of that heat with it. We don't just feel cooler, we actually are cooler. It's about 53% humidity here in the kitchen. Now we're going to do the same thing right after a rainstorm. The humidity is up around 80%. When I take the thermometer out of the water, the temperature is going to go down, but it's not going to go down as much because the water evaporating off the thermometer doesn't have any place to go. When it was 54% humidity, there's plenty of space for that water to evaporate and carry off that heat. But now that it's up around 80%, that water is really going to struggle to get off that thermometer and carry away that heat. And that's why a hot, humid day feels so much worse than a hot, dry day. Researchers measure the combination of heat and humidity with what they call the wet bulb temperature.
Using words like wet bulb temperature, it makes it sound very complicated, but it's just really simple. If the air is so hot and wet that you can't cool yourself, you overheat and you die.
Researchers use 6 hours at a wet bulb temperature of 35 degrees Celsius as the theoretical limit of what humans can survive, though the real limit may be lower. Some places in South Asia and the Persian Gulf have already hit 35 degrees in recent years, though only briefly.
If it's hot now, it's going to get hotter in the future. That's where potentially you may start hitting these limits.
The shores of the Persian Gulf are primed to hit that limit. The deserts around it are already scorching in the summer, and the Persian Gulf itself is shallow, so as it heats up, it soaks the air with humidity.
Places like Dubai, Doha, Abu Dhabi, they are located next to the Gulf, and the air would blow from the water into the land, and those coastal areas would have very high wet bulb temperature.
In the worst case scenario, models show areas right along the Persian Gulf coast may top that 35-degree wet bulb temperature by the end of the century. If the world limits its greenhouse gas emissions, the unlivable zones shrink to just a few spots. Some of the Persian Gulf countries might be able to adapt to these conditions better than most. They've got the money. Dubai already does massive climate engineering. They built an indoor ski slope in the desert.
In that part of the world, there is resources to be used to help the population protect themselves from those conditions by having air conditioning and so on.
Though air conditioning doesn't do much for people who work outside. Parts of South Asia, too, may become nearly unlivable for people who work outside. And that's most people in some of the places projected to be the hottest and most humid. Plus, most people in these areas can't afford air conditioning at home. That puts millions of people in harm's way.
The combination of the hazard and the vulnerability of that population and the size of the population makes the region of South Asia maybe one of the highest risks for heat waves from climate change.
The highest risk comes just before the monsoon. Temperatures rise through the first months of the year, but it's the humidity that arrives just before the rains that makes the heat especially dangerous. In the worst case scenario, models show a few spots in northeast India and Bangladesh getting too hot to live in by the end of the century. Those spots go away if the world cuts emissions. But big swaths of South Asia would still be left with wet bulb temperatures topping 31 degrees, which is extremely dangerous.
You don't have to make a region uninhabitable to hurt a whole bunch of people and make everyone's life worse.
And on its current path, the world is on track to get a lot worse.
Many parts of the world are going to be in the situation where summer is going to be as hot and wet as the hottest heat wave that people will have experienced in their entire life today. And those include places where a lot of people live. That includes South Asia, that includes Indonesia, that includes parts of Central and South America.
Today, those heat waves kill. They strain power grids, they damage crops. Cutting emissions will lower the damage, but it won't eliminate it. Even places that don't get too hot to live in are going to have to adapt to living on a hotter planet.